The next panel on digital transition and the future of accessibility with Martina Piazza. She's a project officer at Digital Europe.
I'm fine, thank you.
And she the manager of public working group of inclusion and innovation. So please, Martina.
Thank you, Alejandro, and welcome everyone to this third and last panel of this conference. So this panel will try to address the topic of the digital transformation and the future of accessible technologies. So digital technologies are transforming every aspect of our lives. When we talked already this morning of how technologies are applied to our way of learning or shopping or entertaining or any aspect of our everyday life, let's say. And then COVID-19 pandemic happened, and all the digital transformation that we were already going through accelerated incredibly, and digital became part of our everyday life more and more. So in this context, I was wondering, in order to prepare for this panel, what are we doing at the political level in the EU? We already talked about this morning. We talked about the Accessibility Act. And then I was looking for more information about policy that really puts the individual at the center. The European principles, digital principles and rights for citizens is a guideline, this document, which tries to give some guidance to governments, policymakers, but also companies to adopt a human-centered approach when organizing a business, but also making policy. Then we have at European level the Digital Decade policy program, which consists of targets that have been set to be reached in 2030. Among these targets, it says that 80% of the adults in Europe should have the basic skills in the digital environment by 2030. Another target is also to reach 20 million people employed in the ICT sector. So, acknowledging this at the political level, we were wondering what are the efforts of organizations, of businesses in adapting to the digital transformation by also including accessibility programs in their journey. So within this panel, we try to understand the role of accessibility in the digital transformation journey of an organization. We try to understand why is it important to include accessibility programs within the strategy for the digital transformation of an organization. And our speakers will help us to go a little bit more in detail on what are the elements that are essential in order for this process to succeed, and what is needed. So here with me on the stage, we have three speakers with different expertise. You already met before, to my left, Hector Minto, who is Senior Technology Evangelist for Accessibility at Microsoft. Hector has more than 20 years experience in the sector, in specializing in alternative communication, computer access, and home automation for people with physical and learning disabilities. To my right, we have Maddalena Ilario, who is chair of the Reference Site Collaborative Network, which represents all accredited active and healthy aging reference site regions. And then, to my extreme left, we have Lawrence Kerknawi, I hope I pronounced it well, your surname, who is in charge of EU government relations at Zoom Video Communications in Brussels. So we want to start this discussion with a simple and very broad question that I'm addressing to the three of them. How has your company or organization been introducing solutions to improve the accessibility in your services or products? What process, what kind of strategy has your organization adopted to keep up with increasing digitalization of products and services, while guaranteeing they are accessible and inclusive? So I'm going to start with Hector in order of presentation.
Okay.
Please.
Okay, so yeah, well, maybe I'll tell you a bit about the Microsoft piece first, but then also in terms of how we are trying to help organizations with their own digital transformation journeys around accessibility. So Microsoft's done accessibility for an awful long time. But the thing I always start by saying to people is the human relationship with technology has changed massively in that period. There used to be an ambition, for those of my age in the audience that remember, Bill Gates used to say things like, there's going to be a computer on every desk. And now it's like, well, we wake up with computers under our pillows, frankly, right? Sorry if that's just my bad behavior. But, you know, we live with technology. Citizens live with technology now. So in terms of the accessibility story, in my 27 years working in this field, what I've seen is an absolute transition away from specialist equipment, which still has its role, you know, in terms of absolute specialist equipment, through to mainstream equipment and the need for organizations to start thinking about their responsibilities around accessibility. So I think what you're going to keep seeing here is a move away from just the tech companies having to care about accessibility to the retailers, the healthcare organizations, the education establishments are going to have to start thinking about what they build and what they create. So how do you do that? Like, how do you get everybody to a level of confidence where they feel that they can actually design and build accessible solutions? Well, I'll tell you our strategy. We have 4 pillars: culture, processes, product, and innovation. Culture is so, so important. If you have got no idea what disability is, then you are not going to get there. Yeah? So the representation of disability inside an organization is something you have to spend time in. You have to spend time with the community, with your own community, who are, frankly, your best conscience on this topic. There are people with disabilities in every organization, but there's not always a forum to have a conversation about the things that you build or the experiences that you create. But culture is the representation of people with disabilities, but also leadership coaching so that they can have a narrative on this topic. Any organization follows its leaders. And so we spend an awful lot of time with our senior executive sponsors to make sure that they understand their responsibilities for accessibility and give them narrative. You know, it's like, one of the things, I work with some of the biggest companies around the world, and I always say to them, what's your narrative on disability inclusion? And they say, I've got no idea. Whereas we have a narrative document that we share with every employee. If you need to know like why Microsoft cares about accessibility and why it's important to us, we have an 80-page PowerPoint presentation that will take you through it from top to bottom. Yeah. So culture and investing time in the topic is super important. Processes. Once you recognize that people with disabilities work in your organization, what works, what doesn't? So can your blind colleagues read their payslips? It's a really easy one that just brings it home to people. Can you book leave? Are you routinely thinking about your procurement processes and things to make sure that your colleagues and your employees with disabilities are having the best experience in your organization? Once you've got culture and processes and you've got that good relationship starting to buzz, then you can really lean into product innovation. And some of the things that you all take for granted in Microsoft products came from disability. So the message we're constantly getting across the design teams is that when you spend time on this topic, there are 2 things: rigor. You know, you've got to make make sure things are legally accessible and tested for accessibility, but also innovation. Can you actually start to go even further with with what you're building to create a delightful experience? So the blurred background in Teams came from the disability community, right? You know, that's the one that people are always surprised by. It was designed for lip reading. It wasn't designed for security or privacy. It was designed for accessibility. That's because we had an amazing deaf engineer in that team thinking about how she wanted to make the communication experience better for her. So this product piece is where we go next. And then spending time on net new innovation is the other thing. So we have a lot of hacks, and again, looping all the way back to culture, time spent by employees on the topic of accessibility, reinventing the world. Like what could you do that's absolutely amazing? What can you imagine? I brought some with me. We can play around with them afterwards. But we've just released the 3D printed mouse. That came from innovation projects. So people can now 3D print their own mouse according to their own needs. And we now sell that. That's not a core product line for Microsoft, as you might expect, yeah? But it is something that we've delivered to the market because people constantly want to innovate. Once you've got all of those sorts of things moving, it's so much easier to have a conversation about the boring bits of accessibility. I'm looking around the audience just to make sure I'm not getting glared at too much. Yeah, but there are boring parts to it. It is a digital skill. It is a learning. It is something that technologists need to understand. And there is rigor in there, you know, and discipline. And discipline and rigor are really difficult sometimes to maintain focus on. But the representation of disability and the kind of the concept of this is us is probably the secret sauce. You know, it's like this is not something you're doing for some other group, you know, that lives outside of your organization. This is for us as well.
Thank you, thank you. So we will stay on the side of private organizations, let's say, and switch to Lawrence. So Lawrence, what's the strategy at Zoom? What can you share with us? How do you operate?
About the process. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. I think that before looking at how we operate at Zoom, it's important to understand also where we come from. Accessibility is a very complex issue, and you need to really give it proper attention to it. But it's also, for us, very natural because it sits at the core value of Zoom, which is for people to meet in a very easy way, whenever they want, how they want, on their own terms. And enabling that also means that accessibility sits at the core of this value. We were founded in 2011. We're much younger than Microsoft. And we started our accessibility program in 2016. We reached out to this university in California, and we asked, we wanted to understand, like, okay, what do we need, and how do we do it? Building up that knowledge and taking that knowledge in-house. And we then started also developing our tools and working with the University in Washington, where we were starting to sit down on a monthly basis just to understand, like, this is what we're working on. Are our products adequate? What do you expect from us? This is the roadmap. And that collaboration with this university in Washington expanded to a network of universities across the United States, and we still meet today on a monthly basis. And their feedback is honest. They keep us sharp, they keep us on our toes, and that has been very helpful. Getting that feedback from different communities, from subject matter experts. But how do we operate? I don't think that there's a right moment to start with accessibility when you design your product. Accessibility is not a checklist, it's a process. And the sooner you start, the better. So before even starting to design, one of our aims, especially for our accessibility team, is really to sit down with software designers, with engineers, just trying to make them understand what the needs are of different types of people with different disabilities and different experiences, just to make sure that they're aware, because if they're aware of it, you can already avoid so many issues down the line of the development process. And you can double, you can triple, you can quadruple your accessibility team, but you can never replace the impact of having your whole company and all of the employees that don't directly work on accessibility, having that in mind and being aware of it. So we try to embed and bake in accessibility into their frameworks. Once a product is designed, what we will try to do, what we'll do is to test it very heavily by our accessibility team, just to make sure that it's accessible by all groups of people with disabilities, that nobody is left out. And then it will be further heavily tested by a team of external analysts. When launched, if there would be a post-release failure, we will consider it as a bug as serious as any other bugs, and we'll fix it. We will not just say, like, this is nice to have, we can deal with this later. But coming back to the design process and just the entire process, I think that what is important is to have that universal design mindset, and just to develop products and features and tools that work for as many people as possible, and just to have that baked in already, because we use so many features, we don't even think about the fact that these are actually primarily designed for people with certain disabilities, and that helps us so much, and that makes also the product just so much easier. We don't want to make a separate Zoom for people with disabilities. We want to make one Zoom, and closing down on my intervention, just when we look, for example, a nice example of how we start from zero with accessibility is also about, for example, support for screen reader. It takes a lot of time to properly develop your tools and to make sure that it's compatible with most screen readers, but also to take into account that the way that a person that has been blind for all its life is very different than someone who's been blind very recently. They have different skills, and you need to include that also into your process and be aware of that. So disability, not only you have different types of disability, you can have intersectionality there, but also different ways, and also that you need to take into account, and that's really what we strive to do for. And then on the evangelizing, if I pronounce it correctly, that's just so important, just to make sure that, just also solutions engineers, for example, just to make sure that when they speak with their client, with their IT, like, are you aware that, we have this at our disposal? Are you aware of how you can use it? Are you aware of, how your employees are they using it? Just make sure that everyone within the company is aware of it, makes the work of people working directly on accessibility so much more impactful.
Thank you. I think we heard already a lot of good elements to take into account while designing a process of accessibility programs. So we heard how to take into account the culture of a company, how to invest time on the topic, try to involve the community, the users community, but also the colleagues within an organization, understand what are their needs, what are the needs of those with disability in order to integrate and reach a higher level in the delivery of the product or the service. We heard a lot of having to hear the feedback, test the product in order to have a process which is continuous and does not end with the delivery of the product or the service, but goes back to try to get better and better. So I'm now addressing Maddalena in order to understand if she agrees with what has been said already, or if she has some asks also for the industry.
Actually, from the public health service providers that belong into our network includes more than 60 local ecosystem, regional ecosystem that are making an effort in implementing digital solutions for health. So if you look at the healthcare systems as a whole, they are made of interconnected and complex and dynamic services that are now digitally supported, but there is still fragmentation between services. So if you look at the healthcare system as a value chain, you can identify inside this value chain the primary services that are the ones we deliver as clinicians, as nurses in the community, in a variety of settings, at home, in the hospitals, in nursing homes. And then you have the secondary services that are the ones made of training, education. And then we have the support services that are all the management, the digital services that are like a neuronal integrated network of digital solutions. Then you see that there are a number of places where you need to take advantage of inclusive solutions. And if you look at these different layers of that contribute to the delivery of the services, you can look at them from the perspective of the professional, and in that case, you have to look at the training and education pathway journey that trains professionals to deliver services. So you can also look at these services from the perspective of the end users, that is the citizen, the patients, that is taking advantage of inclusive services. So if you look at the different abilities that people have during their journey, on a professional journey, healthcare journey, training journey, you can find a number of places where these accessible solutions can be integrated. And if you look at the evolution of, we are witnessing of the health service systems in terms of community services, integrated services, accessible services, and hospital services that are being technologically supported by big technological solution in terms of not digital, but hard technologies, you understand that you need to strengthen the accessibility of the solutions all the way. So it's, I agree with Susanna when she said that you need an entire ecosystem moving. I was thinking, just to make a simple example, I was thinking of the need of nurses triage. So if you think of a typical triage in an emergency care unit, then you have to have the nurse physically present and the ability and the skills required to this nurse profile as a specific skill professional. If you think of the new type of services that are telemedicine services, digitally supported services, you still need triage nurses, but you have a lot more room for people with different abilities. So you can imagine to redesign the training and education journey in a way that is totally revolutionary, I think. And this is linked to the opportunities that are lay into the telemedicine and also can strengthen our capacity to address the needs of the unmet needs of rural areas, for example, where you have other challenges. But if you have a broader workforce made of nurses that are equipped with different package of skills, then you have a lot more room for service provision if we have accessible tools to provide the services. So I think that the alliance between public and private bodies is very important because it can help us to make the health investment an opportunity for sustainable development, to improve quality of life for everybody, those who provide the services and those who receive the services across the entire value chain.
Thank you. Are there any quick reactions to this?
Maybe I could just kind of just lean on into a new stakeholder map is what I'm hearing from you. Like, so if we think kind of those of us that have been working in the accessibility field for some time, there have been traditional routes towards accessible experiences or the assistive technology people need. We all need to kind of be brave enough to reach out to new stakeholders. Yes. I've always joked about nurses, and I thank you for spraining your wrist on purpose for this. But if you break your arm, the nurse doesn't say, just hit your right shift key 5 times and you can type one-handed. Yeah, right. But that's the truth, right? It's standard. Like, it's standard. That experience should be normal. Like, and if you're checking 50 people with broken wrists out every week in an accident and emergency, why would you not tell somebody like that critical piece of information that would be important to them? So I think as we think about building structural accessibility all around us in society, we also need to do what you're saying here and train a wider group of professionals to start thinking about it. And hopefully that leads to more jobs and more representation for people with disabilities in these, even if I could be brave enough to say, have a more honest conversation about the disability that already exists in the workforces that are in healthcare and other things.
And with an aging population, it's easy. I feel I need some support, already to read. Sometimes I don't hear very well, and so on and so forth. So I think there is a broader concept around abilities.
And the word is confidence.
Yes.
I mean, that's what it boils down to. It's like, how confident are you about this subject?
Yeah. Exactly. And this links also to a second linked discussion that we wanted to address today in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic and the consequences from it. So we know that the pandemic accelerated the pace of this digital transformation. And we also know that it has increased the digital divide, what we were talking about this morning, across different countries, between those who can fully benefit from an enriched, open, inclusive, interoperable, and secure digital environment, and those who cannot. So maybe Maddalena has a first-hand experience on this. Like, did you notice more opportunities for improvement or more challenges from the pandemic?
I think that the challenges of the pandemic are all opportunities. As long as we manage to channel our energies towards addressing, it has been, this morning has been mentioned already, that investing in disease prevention and health promotion has been acknowledged as one of the pillars of sustainability for public health services for a long time, but still there is only less than 3% investment of government in this kind of sector. So I think that accessibility belongs into that realm, because if you think about mobile health solutions and how they can be accessible to everybody, this is a way we can deliver health promotion and early diagnosis to hard-to-reach populations, and not only hard to reach because they are far away in the rural areas, but also because they are in the sachets of society, in socioculturally isolated places and areas of society. So this is accessibility all the way. So I think we need, this is a paradigmatic shift from reactive disease management towards a more proactive, way of delivering services, and I truly believe that digital solutions are our chance to make the change now. We don't have to wait any longer. We have to be brave, as you said, and decide we want to go this way and save our public health systems. This is the way forward.
Thank you. So keeping on this, within this context of the post-pandemic environment, Lawrence, how did the demand for solutions for telework at Zoom increased after, or during and after the pandemic?
Well, I mean, everybody knows that, Zoom surged during the pandemic. And, we didn't came out of nowhere. We existed since we were founded in 2011. And perhaps there's also a reason why Zoom did so well during the pandemic, why people started using Zoom en masse. And that's because Zoom was developed with the simple notion of we want to create something that is as simple as possible and that is video first. So we really focused on video and only then around, sound and all the rest. And we wanted to make it as easy, as minimalistic as possible. So it was very easy to use as well, because when the pandemic hit, grandparents wanted to see their grandchildren, and they might have never used a communications platform. I sure remember before the pandemic that we were doing more calls, just dialing in rather than using Skype or whatnot. So that was maybe why we had a heads up. And when you look at not only the general population but also people with disabilities, I already explained we started in 2016 with our accessibility program, where we started ramping up already. So when COVID-19 hit, we had a communication platform in place that was delivering a high quality of video, but also already had, features and tools in place, and the design was already in place to welcome people with disabilities. And rather than reacting to the COVID-19, we were able to improve and scale up. What we noticed in particular was that especially people with visual disabilities and visual impairments really joined massively Zoom. One of the reasons being, okay, we had I want to say basic features, but maybe they were not so basic a few years ago. But for example, the high contrast and the dark mode, but also support for screen reader which sometimes might not be, completely given proper attention, but we gave proper attention to it from the very beginning, and we supported most screen readers. So an example is, for example, I don't know if you know IFB Solutions, it's a US nonprofit, and they were able to, during the pandemic, to quickly transition to Zoom, using Zoom to recruit and employ people with visual disabilities, but also to offer summer camps and after-school programs to children with visual disabilities. So that was the whole COVID-19 situation. There was already an offering, and Zoom enabled people with disabilities to also not be completely left out, because when COVID-19 hit and everybody is in a crisis, it's very dangerous to just focus on the biggest group of people, the loudest group of people, and maybe not pay enough attention. Governments not paying enough attention to people with disabilities because they're attacked from so many different angles. And so there, I think that technology companies really played a big role in enabling people with disabilities to also have that sense of normality. Moving forward, I think we just made a leap forward of many years with COVID-19, and it's important now also to look at how we can continue to improve on the way that we've gone, and to make sure that we can, when it comes to the workplace, for example, make it as inclusive as possible, but not only by relying also on technology. We shouldn't forget the traditional sectors, HR, physical workplaces. The thing is that I agree with you. COVID-19 is, in some ways a tragedy, but also a massive opportunity, and also for people with disabilities. You had Eurofound published a report, for example, I think in December, analyzing telework regulation. And one of the things they said is that barely any member state pays any attention to people with chronic disease and people with disabilities. So there's an opportunity there as well to make sure, okay, how can we use technology and telework to include more people into the workspace? But on the other hand, it's also very dangerous, because it should not be a lazy excuse to confine people with disabilities to remote work. At Zoom, we really believe in hybrid work, in flexibility. And that means that also the physical workspace needs to remain and be even more accessible for people with disabilities.
I see a lot of positive notes then coming out from the pandemic and the experience. It's a kind of a positive assessment to make it simpler, but within the complexity.
Yeah. I think one thing to add is that everybody was in the same place overnight. Everybody was at home on a computer screen. And what was interesting to me most, specifically to the workplace, was the topic of accessibility suddenly became huge for organizations. For the people with disabilities that were already in work, they'd found ways of working previously. So if somebody was deaf, hard of hearing, they would make sure they arrived early in the meeting room and got to the front of the room and were able to hear. They created their own kind of strategy for inclusion, and then suddenly they were on a screen. And they were more disabled on Wednesday than they were on Tuesday, just by the experience that they were pushed into. And this created a ton of feedback to IT teams and things like this. Suddenly I remember one government agency I was speaking to had 300 deaf, hard of hearing employees that they did not know they had the day before. Yeah, okay, so it's like there was this wider awareness that people had disabilities. They'd been able to kind of cope. I think in education the same, yeah. But suddenly people were unable to cope in this new normal, terrible phrase that I thought we'd left behind, but this new normal that everybody was in, it amplified the conversation around accessibility.
Yeah, I think it's important that we don't forget. I mean, we need to keep the momentum and ensure that this approach goes mainstream, because the risk is that it stays high on the level of the mandatory requirements. You tick a box and then you don't implement. So this is where we focus as a network. We focus on the implementation and on the adaptation, as was also highlighted by Evertian in the previous panels, that you need to work on adapting the implementation part when you exchange good practices, and this is the focus of our organization. So I hope we will be able in the future to strengthen our commitment into looking at accessibility requirements.
Thank you. And so we touch upon the telework aspect and the telecare. What about the e-learning environment? So, Maddalena, you are also a professor at the University of the medical school. What do you see is missing, and where do you see there was some increasing need during the pandemic?
There has been a delay in the formal educational programs to uptake the learnings of the pandemics. There are formal constraints in the programs of the traditional educational pathway, and these constraints delay the integration of the content that we know it's required. And this is important for medical students, as well as for students in the medical professions, like the nurses, the technicians, the speech therapists, and you name it. So I hope there will be an increasing awareness at national levels of the Conference of Directors, of the Ministry of Education, on how to do it fast, because otherwise there will be a gap between the needs of the hospitals to hire trained professionals and the professionals we train at the formal level. So I think there is an urgency to raise, a sense of urgency to stimulate and support. So maybe this kind of events and projects can help into increasing the awareness at the decision makers level.
Yeah. And Hector, what about the side of the service provider on e-learning?
Yes, when I think about learning, just to help give you some context here, obviously we work a lot in education. Microsoft is used in schools an awful lot. For some of the similar trends that we saw there, people started turning to the built-in solutions. When I think about children learning, they stopped using their human supports and started using their digital supports. So we can tell you from the telemetry in our products that the reading supports built into Edge and the immersive reader in OneNote, like the use of it went up 6 times. It's like 600% during the pandemic. People using technology to support their reading rather than a scribe or the dictation tools for writing and those sorts of things. So the reliance on human support wasn't an option for many people, and therefore there was a real accelerated learning of how to use the tools. The other thing I would just mention quickly is when we think about the stakeholder map, I never met so many chief learning officers than I did during the pandemic. And there's a thing here that the concept of lifelong learning in enterprise is real, particularly in the digital space. Digital skilling is always on. You know, you're always learning digital skills, yeah? So you're having to always keep up to date with digital. And therefore, is learning accessible in the workplace for people with disabilities creates a really interesting gap. You know, your career moves forward because you've got all the training available to you. Somebody else's career stops because they're unable to continue learning. And many of the supports that were there for them in college and university are not provided in the workplace. So in terms of our audience for accessibility, let me tell you, chief learning officers are becoming a really interesting group of people who are readily admitting, I know nothing. You know, it's nice when you meet people who say, I don't know anything about this, like, but I need to learn about this. And we're helping them understand, like, what does it take to create an accessible LMS in enterprise? What does it take to make that in university? And how do you also create a culture of creating accessible collateral and making it part of your procurement process? So when we think about all the people who provide learning into Microsoft, one of the things you can't sell us inaccessible content. You know, we won't accept it. Yeah, it's like it's in there in the procurement. So my general view on learning and lifelong learning in education, 2 things. People are really starting to lean into the tools, particularly around legacy content as well. Okay, so some of the tools that are in modern technology, like auto captioning in Windows, really support lifelong learning, especially for some of that legacy content, but also a new group of professionals who really need to get to level 101 on what accessibility is.
Thank you, and I have a quick question, reaction to these as well. Before you shared the feedback that you were receiving from politicians when you were trying to train them, what's the feedback from the people you speak with and you try to?
I had a really nice, interesting conversation in the coffee break as well. So. I genuinely, we've mapped out where does accessibility sit within an organisation. So a CFO, a financial officer, has a different lens than a marketing officer, a learning officer. They've all got to deliver accessibility one way or another, but they don't necessarily know what they've got to do. And so some of the partnership we've been really getting into is like, how do we create specific collateral for specific roles in an organisation so that they're not getting bogged down in stuff that's not interesting to them. They're really focused on what they want to do anyway, like an events team or whatever it is. So that stakeholder map is definitely growing. What's interesting is, and maybe I should send this link round, there's a really interesting Gartner's big in enterprise. Everybody listens to what Gartner says. It's fun. But they're talking about how the CIO is going to be just as important for culture change as the diversity and inclusion leads or the CHRO. The tools that you provide people in the workplace are going to be super important in terms of the culture that you're trying to create. And culture doesn't just mean accessible, it means a lifelong learning organisation. Loads of organisations want to get this learning culture going inside their organisations. Accessibility is one of those ways that we're finding, creates really nice bonds between IT and HR or IT and learning. So I think that's maybe the other call to action is give permission for D&I experts to know nothing about technology and give permission for IT professionals to admit they don't know about accessibility, right? It's like let's at least help them understand though what their deliverables are, moving forward. That's really where we're trying to focus people.
Thank you, very interesting. Are there any reactions from the panel? And then we can open also the floor to the public to jump in with some questions. Does anyone have any questions for our speakers? Yes, Susanna. All right, we have microphones.
So thank you, very interesting discussions. I would like to ask Lawrence, when will Zoom have captions in other languages than English?
We're actually already rolling out captions in other languages. And we will continue to, language support is something that we're really working on. And actually, I think that a few months ago, we had the automated translation captions that was released. And we're releasing it also from English to multiple languages and vice versa. And we're also working on making it cross-sectional. So it's already there, and we're working on it, and we're very excited about it.
Okay. Good. Because language is also part of accessibility.
Definitely.
Maybe I could just quickly talk about how the pandemic has also driven things that we didn't think were possible before. So, because it's created this real need for some of those things you're talking about, including language. So, PowerPoint, PowerPoint in Teams, people can now translate the content as well as have the captions, right? So there's this idea that actually, if the content is all in English, that's just as important as the captions. So now my French team come prepared with French. The French do it deliberately, just to everything's always in English to the French, and
they don't like it.
They don't like it. I love it. So now what they do is they turn up in every meeting I have with them with French slides because I've told them that I can translate it into English using PowerPoint. The trade-off is they've got to use PowerPoint properly. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. And actually, accessibility and language, from an organisational perspective, they're both exclusion, aren't they? And I think that's where where organisations are really looking towards inclusion, not just accessibility.
Yeah, definitely. Are there any other questions? Or maybe talking about language. I remember we had a conversation with the speakers, and we were talking about having the same definition of accessibility within the same organization or throughout the value chain. Do you happen to have the same concept in mind of accessibility when you start talking about it, when you start integrating your strategies in your organization? Do you have the same concept, or do you usually have to first sit down and agree on what does it mean for us? Right, I see Hector
I always
already
laugh
there.
because, I mean, I'm sure others will know that when you talk about accessibility, there's the commercial accessibility, the connectivity accessibility, and you feel like you have to go through all those conversations first before you get to disability and accessibility sometimes. So, you know, I think certainly when it comes to policymakers, disability inclusion is what accessibility has to be spelled out as opposed to so many people go straight to connectivity as one example. So and that's why mandated training is so important. I mean, you know, we've got to get everybody on the same page. We're trying with all of our partners around the world to really sort of get everybody to that level 101. Yeah, it's important.
Yeah. To me, accessibility means equity. Equity in health service provision, equity in all kinds of societal, benefits and inclusion. So if you decline it in the health field, it is something you cannot not do.
But it also needs to be seen as a digital skill. Okay,
Oh, yeah.
So everybody knows captions are available. Right? So everybody knows you can have video that is captioned and video that is not captioned, but how many people know how to do the captions?
It's a matter of
that's the important thing.
integrate that gesture into your daily routine.
Yeah.
So you need to change your comfort zone into something
Exactly.
different.
Yeah.
So there is an effort to be made initially.
And it's not difficult, but it is always deliberate. Like,
Yes.
it's not going to happen by accident.
Yeah, so you need to have a strong commitment that is top down.
And that's also where it's easy when you speak about technology and digital transition and, accessibility to fall into a trap of constantly wanting to release new fancy features.
Mm-hmm.
But, you're nothing with those features if you don't know how to use them and where to find them. You can have a new blog and look at what we've done now and what we've done now. If it's not used, it's not used, and nobody is advancing.
And
with
maybe
it.
that's the next frontier for accessibility is the confidence of discoverability in people's design.
Discoverability, but also just you may have more impact by just sitting down with all your clients and just making sure that they understand it and making it like an essential part of onboarding a big client, just to make sure like this is what you do, and do you have people with disabilities, and what is your feedback? And I think that digital tools are very good, and Microsoft and Zoom plays a big role in it. But companies and clients can also play a big role in it, because you should not just rely on what is out there. You can also push yourself, and go to Microsoft and go to Zoom and go to those other companies that develop those tools and those features. Like, hey, we have this. We actually have an example. HSBC, which is one of our clients, reached out to us because they had a person that had a epilepsy attack during a meeting because of the Flemish images.
Yeah.
And so they reached out to us and they said, we have this issue. First of all, you need to be aware as a company to say, we have this issue, we acknowledge it, we want to do something about it to make sure that you can continue doing your job. And they reached out to us and they asked, okay, what can you do about it? And so as Zoom, we say, okay, what is the problem? What can we as Zoom potentially do? Understand the cause, what triggers those attacks, and then we developed an algorithm that can automatically detect when images and lights can potentially have a harmful impact. So that is not something that came from us. That came from a client of us that went to us, and then we started working with them with experts to develop that algorithm. So it's a multi-stakeholder ecosystem, and everybody needs to work on it. You can build all the tools you want. If you don't know where to find them, they will not be used.
Top-down request in this case. Yes, we have a question from the back.
Yeah, hello, my name is Alia. I'm working for Fresno we're giving support to this project. And during the conclusions of the project, we realized that big corporate companies like Microsoft and Zoom are really on board on accessibility. But we've heard also today that there's a lot of companies that are working in the technological sector that are really small companies. like 20 minus, like in Austria. So maybe Microsoft, maybe you don't remember when you were a small company, but maybe.
I wasn't there.
But maybe Lawrence has maybe a memory of when you were smaller. And what you mentioned that you went to the university. What was the motivation? Because there's always for diversity the case of diversity, the case of accessibility.
Exactly.
We need to make some policy recommendations in this project.
Yeah.
And so what would you say to these 20-person companies? I mean, how can we engage them? How can we convince them? What did you do?
So, and I think that it goes, I wasn't there, of course, in California in 2011, 16. But, you know, it starts with your culture. I mean, you mentioned the culture. It starts with your core values, and accessibility is just, it was very natural for us to end up and start working on this. Also because it was in our value to make sure that if you really want your product, your platform, your whatnot to be accessed and used by as many people as possible, you will end up doing a lot of work on accessibility. And you know, I had a lot of discussions with our head of accessibility in the run-up to this discussion, and you know, you build up a company, you focus on your core issues, and soon you realize, okay, we want to make it more accessible, but we know nothing about it, and so it's just about, you know, reaching out to people that do have that knowledge. Like, can you help us? Like being honest about it. Like, we don't know, and we want you to help us understand so that we can chart our own path. You have a lot of guidelines and standards. This is the basic requirement. But again, I don't think we don't see accessibility as a checkbox. I think that, you know, there is a fundament, and reaching out to people that can help you go further and beyond, that would be, I think that's the first step. I don't know if that answers your question.
Right. Maybe I can just add, I mean, we still live in a world where 98% of the world's websites are inaccessible, right? So people have not worked out the value add of accessibility en masse across the web. Problem. I do think we've got to make it easier for people to deliver an accessible experience. And that's where standards and testing do play a role. So, I mean, interestingly, I get invited to speak at startup hubs all the time. You know, I get pulled on as like, you know, the person, come and talk about inclusion, you know, and I'll go and meet 50 companies all with their own ideas about new sustainability products. I remember that was the last one I was at. And I'm in there to talk about accessibility, and you do see a proportion of the people just switch off. Yep, because they're just sitting there and, you know, this is not our gig. And then you start showing them examples of electricity companies who've created accessible smart home monitors, and they're advertising on it, and they're creating their brand of inclusion on it. The future for this is reaching the people, the brand value people. Yeah. So startups are going to want to find a way to differentiate themselves in the market, and you know, there's going to be elements of the rigor of accessibility. We've got to make it easier. So one thing, if you ever meet a startup, we have free tools from Microsoft where they can go and test their product for accessibility. It's called Accessibility Insights. Go test it. Yeah? Even if you don't care about the topic, go test it and find out how accessible you are is lesson number one. And at least know whether you're accessible or not. But the stories of where companies like Zoom and others are starting to actually go out on the front foot on this and saying, hey, we're an inclusive option. Do you as the customer care about inclusion? Do you want to buy the inclusive product? We've got to get to that as well. We just recently finished some work with a company called Haleon. Now, Haleon is a spin-off from GlaxoSmithKline. So they're not a startup, but they are working on their brand. Like, what's their value? And they're in healthcare. They're consumer healthcare. They do Voltarol and chapstick and, you know, all of these consumer healthcare products. And they've partnered with us to develop our Seeing AI app so that it works with all of their products. So now if you're blind and you can't read the label, they've literally done TV adverts. If you can't read the label, you can now use this app from Microsoft and Haleon to read if you cannot read that tiny print on your toothpaste or whatever it might be. They're getting on the front foot as an inclusive brand. And I think that might be the secret for some, that might be the motivator for some startups, is actually, do you want to get inclusion into your brand messaging as early as possible, and then also making the rigor of accessibility easier to do. creating accessible products is not difficult. Like, let's be super clear, it is deliberate though, and you've got to invest time in it. But the actual, to make a website basically accessible is not difficult. It's just not requested often enough.
All right. So can we talk about the transformation in the transformation, the accessible transformation within the process of digital transformation? Just to conclude, just 2 minutes we have left. What about the future? What about this transformation that needs to be done? Some recommendations from you are needed, I think, for both policymakers and the industry and anyone wishing to have or dealing with accessibility.
Looking at the public health systems, I would recommend to push policymakers into implementation of accessibility, because we have all the laws, all the regulatory requirements and frameworks and whichever, but we need to make it a real thing. And you made a good example when you referred to websites, because accessibility of the websites of our hospitals and local health agencies is really poor. So, and it doesn't take much, as you said. So it's a matter of commitment. So that, and if commitment has to be top down, then maybe
that's the secret.
We can do something about it.
All right. Yes. Quick reaction, Hector.
I have one sentence, I guess, which is I really hope we can start seeing industry-specific narrative on disability inclusion. So all too often we see tech companies talking about the accessibility they provide, but we don't see enough banks, enough retailers, enough healthcare organizations saying, hey, we want to be the inclusive option, or, you know, let us tell you about how people with disabilities use our products. So I think very specific narratives around industries is what I'm hoping we move towards.
Thank you. Lawrence.
3 short comments, I think. One is universal design. I think that, you know, also to go back to the question, we shouldn't see accessibility as additional work. I think see it as you know, a challenge, an exercise of like, how can I make my product more inclusive and easier? Because the easier it is, the more accessible it is, the more it will be used. So, and many of the accessibility features we have today are just like built into our product, into the Microsoft product, into the Zoom product. So I think that is the first one. Like, a lot can be solved, not everything, but a lot can be solved with universal design and just thinking already at the very initial process. Second of all, I think for policymakers, I mentioned the Eurofound study where they said, like, you know, telework legislation, you know, has no attention to people with chronic diseases, people with, you know, disabilities, and policymakers should really seize the opportunity to see, like, okay, how can we include this vast group of people into the workforce? So policymakers need to be more attentive to it. And third one, I think, is about spreading the message. Just like speak with people. Don't speak just with policymakers, and don't just focus on tech companies. Focus on everyone that has a role to play. Everyone has a role to play. Like even like the fact that I'm here speaking about it and wanting to speak about it. I'm not core accessibility person, but you know, just by being aware, you see the potential in every way. And every person, every employee within any company can play, to some extent, in some way, a role to driving more inclusivity. So those are the 3 ones.
Thank you. Thank you. So we all have a mission, I guess, after this conference, for those who didn't have it before, of course. I think we need to close, as we already went over time. I would like to thank our speakers and also the public for sharing these questions and insights. And we hand over to the next presentations.